Hello there. Today's video is almost part of the Q&A session we've been running at the moment in the last month or so, in that there have been a few questions about the late Roman army and how the military system worked in the later empire. Now, this one isn't a specific answer to any of those. It's more of an introduction to some of the issues that are worth bearing in mind when we come to look to this. Now, next year I've got a couple of themes planned. One will be on cavalry throughout the Roman period and to some extent later as well, how that functions, how it works, its role in battle, its role on campaign, its role in the peacetime army, how it's recruited, stocked, manned, that sort of thing. We'll also do something on the later centuries, from the 3rd century through to maybe the 6th AD, perhaps into the 7th as well. How the army develops, how the Roman army operates, what sort of wars it's fighting, how it's doing so in that period. So we'll do a couple of videos on different aspects of that. It won't be for a while because there's other things I need to do in between and just having the time to put all that together. So today we're really looking at some of my thoughts on how to approach understanding the later Roman army. And it goes back to a paper I gave quite a while ago and at a conference, and then I've given versions of it at other times. Looking at the late Roman army, but as I put it, asking some of the awkward questions, because certain things have developed in ways and there are assumptions that have become so deeply embedded that maybe it's worth going back to basics, going back to the start and raising a few awkward questions to see whether or not actually we should be quite so adamant that this is how things worked. So let's begin with a quote, an ironic comment from a senior administrator, Ursulus, in AD 360, who said, "Behold with what courage the cities are defended by our soldiers, for whose abundance of pay the wealth of the empire is already becoming insufficient." The late Roman army gives the impression of being very, very big, very, very expensive, and yet it doesn't always do the job that's asked of it. Now, you could say that about the army in other periods as well. There have been military disasters at almost every period of Roman history, but more successes. But let's start off with considering it. And again, as always, we come to the question of sources. Where do we get our information from that allows us to reconstruct how the army, how the military system of the empire worked in those later periods, what went right, what went wrong, how it was all supposed to function? This is very difficult because it's poor in most cases. There are large periods where we don't have much information. There are topics where, compared, say, to the archaeology of earlier on, there's much less to go on. We don't really have decent literary sources, and you need to begin. When you come to understanding an army, it comes down in the end to descriptions of how it operated, how it did things. It's all very well looking at equipment, armor, fortifications, bases, that sort of thing. Fascinating though that can be, that doesn't really tell you how it actually worked. There's always a big leap to go from the individual warrior or soldier with his sword, his shield, his spear, armor, whatever it might be, and then go from that to saying, well, this is how 1,000 of them or 10,000 of them or 20,000 of them fight. And where does this individual fit within that army? What's the balance of different troop types, for instance? Until you get something like a narrative account of campaigns and battles, it's very, very hard to understand just what's going on. Ammianus Marcellinus is the big exception, the 4th century historian who left this wonderfully detailed account of the army on campaign, as well as the wider politics and nature of the empire functioning. Sadly, we've only got fragments of it. We have a small part of a book that began its coverage in AD 96 with the death of Domitian, the accession of Nerva, continuing on from where Tacitus stopped. That was always the idea behind it. But most of that is lost. We just have a small, relatively small section. You know, it still chunks, it still translates as 3 volumes in the L'Herbe, a decently chunky Penguin classic. We have a period in the middle part of the 4th century AD, going up to the Adrianople campaign, disaster and pretty much petering out after that. So it deals with Constantius II, it deals with the Emperor Julian, his expedition, Jovian, Valentinian and Valens, that sort of period. There are other emperors who come and go within it, but it's basically that period. And within that, it is marvellous in the level of detail it gives us about how the army is supposed to operate, how it doesn't always work that way. He tells us about sieges, he gives a few descriptions of battles, he gives a lot of discussion of campaigning, both in the east, on the frontier there, on the Rhine, in that area in Europe, within the context, a little bit of civil wars, and even more, some of these sort of internal problems of rebellion and raiding and this sort of thing. But there's no good account of a battle for the 3rd century AD at all. You get some bits in Dio, in Herodian and others, but they're rather stylized, they're not that long. There's nothing like Ammianus for that whole century. There's really nothing like Ammianus for the 2nd century AD either. So it's not so very unusual. Much of the 4th, we have that problem. You know, think of the grand campaigns of Constantine, and the sources for them are extremely poor. 5th century, again, black hole completely in terms of anything like that sort of detail when it comes to narrative of what's going on, how a war is fought, how the army actually operates. Now, as I've said, it's not that unusual. 2nd century AD is very poor as well. Bits of the 1st century AD are missing, fragmentary, and earlier on. So the lack of good literary sources isn't something too unusual, but it's particularly pronounced. We have more for the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, and we have decent amounts for sort of 2nd Punic War era. Polybius, fairly brief account of the 1st Punic War, but at least it's decent. But on either side of it, you know, when you try to reconstruct the war against Pyrrhus, much, much harder. For all his flaws, the fact that we have lost so much of Livy's account, let alone Cato the Elder before, or Sallust's histories for much of the 1st century, all these things that we know existed but have not survived, or have survived only in tiny fragments. So we just lack that basic detail. The archaeology is a little bit different in that the pattern is quite good for the 3rd century AD. You're still, for much of that, with the army that has built these big permanent bases from the sort of time of Augustus onwards, has tended to make a lot of inscriptions, many of which have survived, and other documents that tend to be preserved. So we get a better glimpse of the army's structure, of its bases, of how it supported itself, how it was supposed to operate, and to some degree the evidence for equipment, helmets, armour, weapons, horse harness, horse trappings, other bits of clothing, you know, hobnails from Caligae boots, this sort of thing. So the archaeology is pretty good for a fair bit of the 3rd century. Then it starts to get less, partly because later on there are fewer sites that are so distinctively military. You know, the big legionary fortresses are pretty much all abandoned by the early 4th century. Some of the auxiliary forts that were about a 10th the size, go back and look at the video comparing the different fort sizes and different types of bases, if you want to look at that. Quite a few of those are abandoned as well. When new military bases are built in the later period, they tend to have stronger defences but cover a much smaller area. As a result, there's less chance of finding material stuff, paraphernalia, equipment, all of these things. There's still a reasonable amount, but it's less than earlier. And the context means that I did the video of the visit to Caerwent, Venta Silorum, back earlier in the year. You found traces of bolts from ballistae there. You found traces of weaponry. What's harder to say is this evidence of a formal, regular Roman army unit present there at least some of the time, or is this the sort of thing that a city might have for its own defence and its own sort of militia, its own local armed force, whatever you might describe it, might be there. So it gets a little bit harder. One of the things as well that's difficult is when you start losing all the inscriptions, then that's been the primary evidence for our understanding unit names. It's been our main evidence for understanding career patterns at all levels, at all ranks within the army. And lots of details like that, and also things like who the soldiers are, how long they serve, what their relationship is to others, this sort of thing. A lot of that basic detail is much, much more sparse for later on, which makes it that much more difficult to form a pattern and try and say, well, this is what's really going on. This is how it all works in general. So it does drop off. Now, there's been excellent scholarly work on many aspects of these periods we're covering, of this later period from the 3rd century onwards. And I'm really beginning today in the 3rd century AD. Sometimes people jump to the late Roman army as this fully formed entity and don't think about, well, how we got there. How we get from the army of the Principate that we feel is fairly familiar, that there's probably a lot we're getting wrong or we don't understand, to something that is quite distinct in many respects, and in its look and the way it behaved, though also there's a remarkable amount of continuity as well. But because of the lack of evidence, you still get the vast bulk of Roman army studies, and frontier studies tends to be earlier. Now, there are people who are honourably battling to change this, and it helps in some areas, things like Hadrian's Wall. A lot more interest with Rob Collins and the like have been doing things, getting conferences, doing research on what's happening in the later Roman period, what happens after the Romans go. And that's fascinating there because you can see the differences between one phase to another. Elsewhere it isn't so clear, or the evidence isn't quite so well known or well explored, at least so far. And a lot of people, especially for a long time, and even to some extent now, if you're interested in the army, will tend to go early, will tend to get sucked into the periods where the source material is that much better. And my own interest, I've always been more of a Romanist than Hellenist, more of a late Republic, early Empire, but going back into the Middle Republic, sometimes going forward. It's a frighteningly long time ago that I wrote my book, The Fall of the West, or How Rome Fell, the American edition, about the fall of the empire. And this talk first began to take shape while I was doing that, although it had also, before that, I'd been thinking about it when I'd done some teaching on the subject, and it's been mulled over since then. So the army is clearly an important factor in the fall of the empire. For popular historians, you get quite a lot on how does the Roman Empire fall? Why does the Roman Empire fall? Because it's clearly one of the big things people know. If you know about the Roman Empire, you have some idea of mad emperors, the I Claudius stuff, gladiator stuff, all this sort of thing. You know about gladiators, you know about chariot racing. You have the, weren't they modern, which is true in some ways and not in others. But we know that the Roman Empire fell, and if you're in the English-speaking world, the tendency to think it declined and fell after Gibbon's book is very natural. And it is staggering. This entity that was so successful for so long does go, does vanish. Now then, there are a lot of different opinions as to the cause. There are a lot of different opinions over the nature, and the fashion has been in more recent decades to talk about transition, and it turns into the early medieval period, and that perhaps if you were living in some of these areas you might not notice too much difference, and all this sort of thing. Those are big topics, not ones we can go into today. My book's out there for my view. I haven't substantially changed it since I wrote the thing 15 odd years ago. One good thing that's happened, and this was reflected in when we had the conversation with Geoffrey Greatrex a little while ago, that 30, 40 years ago, late antiquity, as it's become known, the later period of Roman history, in every respect, politics, society, economy, military, the lot, tended to be fairly neglected. There were far fewer people working on it than there were in the early period. And it came back to this perception that literary sources were not just fuller, but were also better, superior in quality for the earlier periods. And when classics was still very much language-based or derived from that, the urge was to go there. That's now changed. There has been a great flourishing of studies of the later centuries. in this last generation or so, and it has done wonders. It's greatly improved our understanding of that period, and ideas from that have sometimes then worked back to cause people to reassess their assumptions about the earlier periods as well. One unfortunate side effect of that I perceive, and I think it's quite strong in a lot of the studies on how the empire is functioning administratively and particularly militarily in the later period, is for a while there was almost a need to justify your interest in this later period. And this happens in any academic discipline. Something that hasn't been fashionable for a while or at all, if you suddenly say, well, I want to work on this, then people are likely to ask, well, what's going on? Why are you doing that? Why doesn't anybody do this? There must be a reason, therefore it's not worth doing. And you tend to, it's rather like as a graduate student, and we've all done it, and you meet the youngsters who are doing it now, you have to believe that your thesis, your topic, is the most important thing ever to happen. Because otherwise you wouldn't spend 3+ years of your life obsessing over it, studying it in great detail. You have to care. If you don't care, it shows in your work. And there are people who will do the sort of, fine, they get the qualification, but it's never going to set the study of the period on fire. It's just not, there's no commitment to it. It's all by the numbers as much as anything. You have to care, and therefore there is a tendency often to feel protective to your subject and emphasize how good it is. I think with the late antiquity people, in fact calling it that rather than late Roman, and not wanting to talk about the fall of the empire and certainly not wanting to talk about decline, they tried to show you that, well, actually everything's quite good. Stuff is still great, the empire is still really strong and really big. It's certainly big, it's fairly strong as well. Compared to anybody else out there, it's really, really strong. And that maybe, first of all, maybe people have exaggerated the efficiency of the earlier army, the earlier empire, but also they've downplayed how good things were, that actually the empire was still remarkably strong, and we ought to celebrate this achievement. Within the military context, as we'll see, this has tended to come with the assumption that, well, the world situation had just become that much more hostile, that the system of the early empires simply would not have coped with the challenges faced by emperors in the later 3rd and into the 4th century and beyond, and that actually they were doing really well and better, and this adaptation had to occur. It was a sort of natural response to real serious problems. And there might be something in that. So basically there's a broad theory, and that's that from the 3rd century AD, the threats become far more serious, that the empires really had it fairly easy early on. That's why from Augustus through to Marcus Aurelius, Septimius Severus, they're starting to wobble a bit then. It's been able to be so strong, so prosperous, because it doesn't really face anything too big, nasty and threatening from outside. So there are really two main parts of this. One is to argue that the Germanic peoples are moving from lots of distinct tribal units that are not always terribly united within, say, the Cherusci or the Chatti or whichever group it might be. These start to come together under increasingly dynamic leaders and form confederations, so that you get the Franks, you get the Alemanni, the all men, as it seems to mean, that clearly have come from these earlier peoples and merged together, but are more likely to act as one large group form and fight together. The Goths appear, again, I'd advise everybody go and read Peter Heather on this, because he's not only done so much of the research on this, but he's very good at presenting it as well, the development and the emergence of these groups. Later on, you'll have even bigger, chunkier peoples like the Huns will come along. But this sense that the barbarians outside are getting more efficient at fighting, more politically united, therefore more dangerous. But even more than that, you have the Sassanian Persians who emerge in the 3rd century. Peter Heather will describe them as a new superpower. Plenty of other people adopt exactly the same line. And some will say, well, going back, you can actually look at the 2nd century AD and you can start to see problems emerging then. Marcus Aurelius, we mentioned earlier, famous as the philosopher emperor. Sadly, his commentary on his campaigns haven't survived, but spent a large part, at least of the second half of his reign, on campaign, and some of the chapter headings of the Meditations. They're in frontier outpost army bases. And there you have the big wars fought against the Marcomanni, the Quadi, these people, Germanic peoples, but more on the Danube, that Danube area, that take years and years. The Romans have great difficulty defeating them. The emperor has to go in person to supervise these campaigns, something that's been rare for a very long time. And you can argue this, you can then go to another argument which comes on to all the grand strategy stuff, how the empire worked, frontiers, things we've talked about elsewhere. This idea that there's no central reserve, that your army is basically distributed around the frontier provinces, divided into provincial armies, and if it can't cope with a problem, then there is no reserve on which to draw other than stripping one province elsewhere of its troops, mustering them together, which is going to take time and also weaken that province, and then eventually forming field armies from troops drawn from one or more other provinces and sending them to the area. There's no central reserve, therefore it's difficult to form a field army, is the logic. And that it's very difficult to fight on two fronts at once. Some may go further, and we'll talk about this in another talk I'm planning on tactics, which I sometimes have done as a sort of in tandem with this one. The idea that the old military system has actually become quite rigid, and it was fine for its day, but warfare has moved on, the challenges have moved on, it's become set in its ways, and it simply doesn't function as effectively. The striking thing with all of this, as far as I'm concerned, is that the emphasis again and again is placed on the external threats. The 3rd century is dangerous, it is said, because the Sassanian Persians are a lot tougher, more efficient, more dangerous, more aggressive than the Parthians had ever been. And something similar, if a bit less dramatic, is happening amongst the tribal peoples of Europe, beyond the Rhine, beyond the Danube. They are uniting into these confederations. They have become, partly through auxiliary service with the Romans, they've become better equipped, have a better tactical sense, and they start to fight more effectively. When I was young, there was a wonderful magazine called Look and Learn, and I still remember some of the illustrations from it. One showed the sack of Rome with these Goths marauding around the streets, and at least one of them I can remember having the sort of Heidenheim bronze auxiliary helmet with the cross on the top, which is a couple of centuries out of date by this time, but nevertheless, but the whole point was emphasized in this little article that these Germans had fought for the Roman army, which of course Goths had, so it showed them very much as looking like hairy Roman troops basically coming in and marauding around Rome. But it's all about external pressure. It isn't about internal disorder. The civil war aspect of this, the political instability of the empire, tends to be marginalized. It tends to be seen, if anything, as more of a consequence of the greater external threats than the other way around. Now, I'm not so sure about that, and as we'll see as we go on. And this then comes to several conclusions, that the empire has to change because, coming back to this idea, the world has simply got far more dangerous. So one conclusion, well, it's very hard now for you to just have one man as emperor and for him to do his job. So you need to have more than one emperor because one man can't be in more than one place at the same time. And from Marcus Aurelius onwards, they're having to go out, emperors are having to take command in the field and at least supervise the campaign, even if they don't lead the army in battle, but some of them are doing that. So you need more than one emperor. It can't work under the old idea, which obviously the leap then tends to be towards the tetrarchy, this short-lived experiment under Diocletian of 4 emperors. You have an eastern half of the empire, western half of the empire, a senior Augustus in each one, and a junior Caesar as his assistant. In that form, it barely outlives Diocletian. It very quickly breaks down because there's lots of other people who want to be emperor. Another assumption is that you can't rely on our old amateur, senator, politician come soldiers when they need to be as your senior officers, as your generals, as your provincial governors, your army commanders, all of this sort of thing. They're simply not good enough. In the past, they could make a few mistakes, bumble around, but the centurions would pull them out of the soup and it would all be all right. And anyway, the threats weren't so bad. But by this time, things are so terrible, things are so dangerous that you really need proper professionals, full-time soldiers who will be good at their job, who know what they're doing, and you can trust them with senior command because they'll actually handle things properly. Also need for more troops. Now, a lot of this is based around some pretty wild guesswork, or at least creative modelling of, to a great extent, the Notitia Dignitatum, this document from the end of the 4th, early 5th century listing the offices within the empire, administrative and military, and the army units under the command of various officials and where they're stationed and all this sort of thing. It's not a military document. It was produced by the civilian bureaucracy, which is one warning to start off with, and we'll come back to that both today and on plenty of other occasions. But it presents an army that has far more units than the army of Hadrian, say, in the 2nd century AD, where you basically have about 30-odd legions, and about a similar number, 300, 350 or so cohort-sized formations of auxiliary infantry, cavalry, and some fleet and this sort of thing. There's more units around later on. They appear to be smaller, at least in terms of there's nothing equivalent to the legion of paper strength of 5,000 or so. But you need a bigger army, and many people basing this on the notitia and then assumptions of how big each unit should be will argue that whereas you might have had 300, 350,000 troops in the army, men under arms, in the 2nd century AD, that it's almost double. It's pushing 600,000 by the time you've got to the late 4th century AD. And that again is a necessary response to far greater threats. The dangers are bigger, therefore the army needs to increase in size. That's the only way you can cope. And if you can't manage to keep that up, and it is expensive, and they will then argue that this is a strain on the empire to do this, then that's the weakness, is that you just don't have the military manpower anymore. So that's another thing. So need for more central authority, need for money to support all of this, so that you have to centralize, you have to split off civilian and military administration. The emperors have to do more. You need to raise more money to pay for it all. You need multiple emperors. You have the 3rd century crisis, anarchy, change is almost necessary for the strong empire of the 4th. Most of the arguments around this tend to focus on the 4th century and depict the empire then as a lot more stable than it had been in the 3rd, militarily stronger, militarily more efficient, but radically changed from the old sort of principate ideas of first among equals. You know, this is the era when the emperor is surrounded by ceremony, where instead of you come up to Augustus and he'll shake you by the hand and greet you as an individual, that you prostrate yourself on the floor and kiss the hem of the emperor's robe. Very, very different ideology to how government and imperial power operates by this time. Part of this has come from all these military problems, and that's led, because of this lack of reserves, so you've claimed earlier on, that you get, again, what are often dubbed the mobile field armies of the 4th century that are listed in the Notitia, that appear, the comitatenses, the Palatina units, you know, the Palatine ones, the ones associated with the emperor himself. You're mobile, you've got more cavalry, you're more effective, and therefore the general change, and both in political and military and the system underlying the army, have all been made necessary by these really tough circumstances, by the fact that it is simply so much harder to defend and secure the Roman Empire in this period, because the world outside has got a lot bigger, nastier and more threatening than it ever had been before. So changes occurred, and changes occurred in a distinct way, and in many respects these changes are improvements to produce something more efficient, it will be argued. Certainly not less, but sometimes, as I said, actually this is a better force, it's far more efficient, it's far more logical. And that's been forced upon the Roman Empire, but these are reasonable reactions and healthy reactions that have re-energized, in a sense, the Roman Empire by the 4th century. Now, today I'm going to question quite a few of these assumptions, because although people have sometimes done this, they tend to get repeated again and again as if this is simple fact. And it's actually a lot harder to pin things down, and much of what I've just said in the last few minutes, or probably longer than that, knowing my rambling style, I don't really buy it, or at least not in to that degree, not in the way it's expressed. I think some of it might be right, but a lot actually is probably misleading. So let's go back and consider all of this, and we might as well go as far as the 2nd century AD and look at that period under Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius, where there seems to be a crisis that is foreshadowing what's going to happen in the 3rd century AD. After all, this is the period where the movie The Fall of the Roman Empire, which I know people keep asking, I will get around to because I am very fond of it, but I haven't had time to sit down and watch all 3 hours or whatever it is and then produce a video on it. But we will do a history on screen one about that before too long. And of course, Gibbon begins with the death of Marcus Aurelius, that period. There's a lot going on there that does seem to be pretty bad, and it does seem to have echoes with what follows later. So you have the Parthian War, where the one case in the 160s where the Parthians very clearly start the war, that prompts, you've got a period where, again, you have Marcus Aurelius ruling jointly with Lucius Verus, both been adopted. And it's the first time that 2 emperors function reasonably well and for a decent period until Lucius Verus dies. Verus goes out to supervise the Parthian War. You have all the sort of skeptical sources claiming that he barely leaves Antioch and doesn't really do very much. Nevertheless, the Roman army goes down the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, burns Ctesiphon. It returns with lots of loot, but also, it seems, with the plague that then starts to ravage the Roman Empire over the next decade or so. Verus may well be a victim of it. Other quite prominent people were. So you have, at around the time that's happening, you start to get defeats on the Danube, breakthroughs of tribes raiding beyond, and some will eventually, there are people who get, raiding bands get as far as Aquileia, the edge of northern Italy. That seems to be the pattern. More than one threat, the empire can't cope, so problem somewhere, concentrating your military Right, sorry, bit of an interruption then. I've just having a cooker delivered today, so they've just come to deliver it, but they haven't been able to fit the thing yet. So I think I was in the middle of Marcus Aurelius, and we just talked about the Marcomanni Quadi, people like that, raiding across the Danube. One thing that tends to get forgotten a little bit when everybody's focusing on military systems, organization, deployment, is the plague, the Antonine Plague. Now, again, not a topic we can deal with in any great detail, a very difficult one to understand because we don't have the same sort of evidence as we do, for instance, for the Black Death in the 14th century. Not far from where I live, there's a partly reconstructed medieval village, a place called Cosmeston, which was one of these settlements that just disappears at that time. It had been thriving up until then and goes, because you have this drastic reduction in population. That's hinted at, that's implied by the sources such as they are for this period, and it seems entirely logical, but we can't quantify it. Now, it's interesting that Dio talks about the plague coming back, being spread by the soldiers, being particularly virulent in army camps as well as cities. And if you think at those forts and fortresses and the like that we've discussed in other videos, you're crowding an awful lot of humanity into a small space. So if an epidemic does start raging, it's really going to spread through it. So we don't know how many soldiers died as a result of this plague. We do get the impression that quite a lot of senators did. This does go through the aristocracy as well. But even for the ones who came back, many died, but those who survive under those circumstances, many who recover would not be physically fit for a long time. Certainly not have the stamina, and depending on the very nature of the disease, which is something we, again, can't pin down in the same way you can't be sure of the plague in Athens in 5th century BC that killed Pericles and did so much damage that Thucydides contracted, suffered, but survived. You can't tell what it is, partly because the way these diseases will have mutated during the period. Even something that exists now might not be the same in terms of symptoms as the one described by our sources, which often means that because we can't tie up the specific symptoms specifically or conditions, it's very hard to pin it down to anything. But think about it this way. You have this epidemic. A significant number of your soldiers do die as a result. Even more are sick for a long period, even if they recover. And they may be severely weakened, they may suffer relapses. It's hard to tell. It's rather like if you think of Duke of Wellington's army in the Peninsular War after the Walcheren campaign, where the army went off to the Netherlands and bogged down in a siege and lots of people died of fever, or suffered it and survived. But many of the battalions that came out subsequently proved to be very sickly. They couldn't cope with long marches. They tended to fall ill rather easily. So you can have these longer term effects from a physical point of view, even though you haven't actually been killed by the disease. But far more than that, try to think as well about how the army operates and the level of dislocation this will have imposed on training, on the administration, on the supply system. Now, this is a really dramatic, deeply unpleasant event that disrupts everything in what you normally do. It's not really surprising that the army in this period isn't always doing too well, and that after this has happened, you've had the Parthian War where they have done quite well, troops have come back to Europe and then spread this plague, suffered from it, many have died, that the army isn't performing too well in maintaining and dominating the frontier areas on the Danube shouldn't really surprise us very much. So when it all kicks off, maybe we should be a little bit more cautious before assuming that this is a basic institutional problem. The way the military system works hasn't coped. This is the military system under extreme circumstances, under great stress because of the plague. And that isn't going to help. So again, just something to bear in mind. And when we look at someone like Pertinax, who has tried and failed to get a commission as a centurion in the army, eventually gets an equestrian commission as commander of a cohort, does so well that Marcus Aurelius promotes him into the Senate. He gets command of successive legions, he gets a senatorial career, and eventually is considered suitable to be emperor, partly because nobody's got anything against him. There's a lot more room for that sort of career in this period, in the same way that in the aftermath of the Second Punic War, you have a Scipio Africanus who gets to high command far younger than normal. You have Flamininus, the commander in the Second Macedonian War, who's consul at 30. When at Cannae you've killed 80 senators in a day, when a third of the Senate dies in the first 3 campaigns of the war, that creates room at the top. They have to be replaced, and it means people with talent, luck and skill can do far better. Right. Oh, come on in. Guess he hasn't made an appearance for a while, so let's... Oh, he's knocked off my microphone. Right, after that brief effort at grabbing Gussie to try and make him put in an appearance and boost the viewership of this channel, managed to knock my microphone off my jacket, so I don't know whether you got all of that on my jacket, my sweater. So you have periods where, because of exceptionally high casualty rates, which is what you're probably getting with the plague as well, there's a lot more room for people to rise far faster and better. And that's a good thing, and it means that the army is probably gaining lots of talented individuals, but also it isn't a reflection of normality. It isn't necessarily a reflection that you need to promote from outside your normal sources because your normal sources tend to be inadequate in the job. They're not good commanders, they're not sufficiently experienced. The idea these senators are just a load of bumbling amateurs, it's because they're dead. There aren't enough to choose from in the first place. Your normal pool has been drastically reduced, therefore you need to look elsewhere. And that happens, it's very obvious there at the late 3rd, early 2nd century BC. It's happening here as well. So let's move on to our next topic. Let's think about that. So let's think about the civil wars, the disorders of the 3rd century. I mean, one thing at first that doesn't seem to have in common with Marcus Aurelius is the civil war aspect, but then of course you do have the rebellion in 175 of Vidius Cassius, when a false rumour spreads that Marcus Aurelius has died, the governor of Syria proclaims himself emperor, then discovers that Marcus Aurelius isn't dead, so the whole thing's rather a damp squib because he wasn't rebelling against him, just simply saying, well, if there's a vacuum, if there's nobody to succeed him, Commodus not yet old enough at this point to be considered a viable heir, then I might as well take over. So you've had, again, in that instability, a little bit of that, but it's ended almost bloodlessly. The leader has killed himself and some around him have been executed, but on the whole there isn't a battle, there aren't major executions involving this. There is a tendency to take for granted the civil war period of the 3rd century crisis, as it's often called. You have around 60 emperors or usurpers, people claiming to be emperors, from 235 to 285. So that's an awful lot. That's a staggering number. It's by far the worst period of civil disorder in Rome's history. Yes, you've had the 1st century BC disrupted. It doesn't go on quite as long. This is worse. The 1st century BC is probably the closest to it. The vast majority of these emperors are murdered by their own officers, their own staff. The Emperor Decius managed to get himself killed by the Goths. Valerian managed to get himself captured by the Persians. Claudius Gothicus dies of the plague, but he's about the only one who dies of natural causes. Far more are killed by Romans than the one captured and one killed by the enemy, by non-Romans, by foreigners, by outsiders. There's a tendency to focus on the period. Now, those on either side, not so stable either, but if you look 31 BC through to AD 180, you have 16 emperors, or 17 if you include Lucius Verus as co-emperor. 180 to 235, 10, or again 11 if you include Geta, even more if usurpers are counted. So it is starting to get significantly worse in that period. The 1st and 2nd centuries AD, on the whole, you have the big civil war at the death of Nero, the Vindex rebellion before that, you have the abortive rebellion against Domitian, you have Vidius Cassius, and you have, after the death of Pertinax, you have the civil war then that leads to the rise of Septimius Severus. It is a lot more stable in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The 3rd century begins badly and gets worse, and it's only marginally better afterwards. Again, it is worth reminding ourselves that from the end of this supposed 3rd century crisis, there are still only 2 decades afterwards until the fall of Romulus Augustulus in the West without a civil war. So what that means is that everyone who reaches adulthood lives through a civil war or usurpation. Now, some of these are quite local affairs. They don't go very far. Oh, excuse me a minute, my voice is going. But nevertheless, there tend to be ripple effects. And this is something that's brought out so marvellously by Ammianus' narrative when we have the detail. You have the characters like Paul the Chain, as he's nicknamed, with these officials who make considerable profit and also advance their own career by condemning other people, accusing them of disloyalty, accusing them of rebellion, accusing them of involvement in past usurpations, therefore you can confiscate their property, take a share of it, all this sort of thing. If you think the Silvanus incident described in detail in Ammianus begins when somebody forges a document of the army commander on the Rhine and claims that he's been plotting against the emperor, and eventually he feels he has to rebel because he's dead anyway. It is a very different world. It is a much more neurotic, nervous, frightened world than even under the madder emperors early on, let alone under an Augustus or a Trajan or somebody like that. So civil war's part of daily life, and I do feel this is one thing that bothers me, that even now scholars don't tend to study it and they tend to just accept it as part of the wallpaper. It's the background. It's something that's going on. It just means that being an emperor in late antiquity is that much more dangerous. But all of this instability has happened because of problems from outside. It comes back to this. So let's take a quote from Dio. If I find it, if I can find it. Ah, there we go. Right, so this is talking about the rebellion against Macrinus in 218. So getting to the sort of stuff that I suppose if there's a Gladiator 3 they might get into, though, you know, what relation it will bear to anything historical doesn't, probably best not to think about. So, Dio says this: by this means they corrupted all the soldiers who were with Julianus, the more so as these were eager for revolt. So the assailants slew their commanders, with the exception of Julianus, who escaped in flight, and surrendered themselves and their arms to the false Antoninus. This is going to be the Emperor Elagabalus. For when an attempt to restrain them was made by their centurions and other under-officers, I didn't have time to check the Greek to see what he actually says there, and they were consequently hesitating, Eutychianus sent Festus and persuaded them to kill their officers, offering as a prize to its, not a prize, not a prose, apology, to each soldier who should slay his man, the victim's property and his position in the army. Think about this again. You've just got a situation where a legion is being convinced to defect from the emperor, who's only been emperor for barely a year after arranging the murder of Caracalla. He's a former Praetorian prefect, and now you've produced this heir, you've claimed to the throne, and you're trying to... Officers are trying to keep the soldiers under discipline, keep them, no, you've sworn an oath to Macrinus, the emperor, let's stay loyal to him. So you basically bribe them, the soldiers, people you can persuade to murder these and take their property. So people can become wealthy by killing the tribunes, the centurions, the other officers within the unit, and you get some of what they had. I think the dislocation involved in civil war is something that is minimized far too often. From the point of view of military discipline, if you don't know who can be trusted, if you don't know that when you give an order to your troops to do something, that they might suddenly decide, actually, we don't believe in the emperor your commission comes from, or you're supporting, we believe in somebody else, so we're going to kill you. That raises questions. How does the discipline really work if you get to this point? And the more often it happens, the more nervous everyone is. Every time these civil wars come to the point of war, come to battle, then Roman soldiers fight other Roman soldiers, kill other Roman soldiers. Divisions are often on provincial lines. Maybe the army of one province will go for one candidate, the army of another province for a different one, as is the case with Septimius Severus and his two rivals. But also, because of the way the army works, because legions in particular tend to be broken up into detachments that are sent around for various jobs, end up as vexillation serving with field forces in other provinces, there is quite a good chance of people from the same unit ending up on different sides. So what do they do? How does this all affect the ordinary career pattern, the ordinary chances of promotion? Because clearly some people are doing very well. They back the right side in a civil war and they suddenly shoot up the promotion ladder and get far more responsibilities far more quickly. So again, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but I think they sort of look at the political aspect in the civil war and think, oh, well, you know, this man's been discredited because this campaign didn't go too well against this foreign enemy. And yes, that's true. But they're not looking at the consequences for how the army is working or the state is working from this willingness of Romans to fight each other. So let's turn to this idea of bigger external threats, this problem, this danger that you have the Sassanian Persians, you have the Germanic confederations, and later on it will lead to other big groups coming through, and the Goths will appear, the Huns even later than that. Huns are rather a different thing, but again, we can come to that in due course, not necessarily today, but we will when we look at the later period. In general, while all these ideas emphasizing the healthiness of the Roman Empire and how it was flexible enough to adapt to what is perceived as a new situation, change itself, change its institutions, become more efficient, those who've tended to look at the Iron Age communities involved, the Franks, the Alemanni, people like that, are rather more sceptical about the whole idea of political unification, of these confederations being anything other than the fairly loose things that we've seen now and again earlier on. You know, Caesar talks about the Suebi as this vast group of tribes, in part because he's trying to say, well, this is why I'm not going to try and conquer them, I'll just stop here, but I'll keep them out of Gaul, I'll keep them out of Roman territory, Roman controlled territory. You don't get groups like the Franks and Alemanni firmly attested really until later in the 3rd century. So they seem to appear after a lot of the problems have occurred. Now that might just be a reflection of the sources, which as we say are poor, but it's worth considering. More striking though is when you do on those rare occasions, so it tends to be Ammianus and like, get more detailed descriptions of how these peoples fight, the size of their armies, the sort of tactics they use, the way the armies move, the sort of war they wage, it actually doesn't look significantly different from the sort of thing that Caesar is describing and that you see again and again in earlier periods. The scale hasn't changed very much. There doesn't seem to be much difference from the 1st century through to the 4th in how Germanic peoples go to war, in terms of the type of warfare, the emphasis on raiding, the occasional battles, the avoidance of sieges as much as possible. They're not good at that sort of thing. When the Romans attack into their territory, the Romans almost always get hit on the way home rather than the way in, because it takes a while to raise these armies, to muster them. In the 5th century, things start to change where you get warlords setting up kingdoms within the Roman Empire. Some of their armies that develop there can be a bit different, though again that's a different sort of problem altogether. So you have to wonder why the 3rd century should be seen as different. There's clearly a serious problem of raiding in several areas. Getting into northwest Gaul, but you get these raiding bands that reach Italy, even Spain. But is that because there are more people outside, better organized, more efficient, better at fighting? They might, perhaps some of them becoming better equipped. After all, you get these big bog finds in Denmark and the like of Roman swords in Scandinavia. They tend to be more 4th century, but you're starting to get them from into the 3rd. Oh, sorry, I'll stop. No, hopefully my phone has done its stuff, so that should be okay. And there won't be any more bings and bongs before we go on. However, it's worth thinking about some of the aspects that might be going on. Come back to the civil wars. So when the Romans are drawing away troops from their frontier armies to go off and fight in a bid to make the leader emperor or fight on behalf of one or another, they're not on the frontiers, they're not operating that system. All the stuff we've talked about in the frontiers videos, that one from a while back about raiding the Roman period. If you look strong, if there are people there, then you tend to deter most big raids because anybody who gets in doesn't get home, or not enough of them to encourage more people to come. However, if the people aren't there, if the raids come in and succeed, then next year there's likely to be more of them and they're likely to be bigger. That pattern is there from 2nd century BC, Republican frontiers, right the way through again and again. And in a civil war, you are drawing people away from the frontiers, just as in the Marcus Aurelius period, you have an army that's weakened by plague, and has suffered from this epidemic and simply isn't as strong as it used to be, therefore is not in a position to man the frontiers. Again, the theme I've tried to push again and again with earlier on is that it's all very well looking at the fortifications, it's all very well looking at structures like Hadrian's Wall. Unless there are troops in sufficient numbers and sufficiently efficient to operate these things, to deal with raids that come in, then you will be perceived as vulnerable, you will be attacked more, and therefore things will escalate. So that's one thing. Another thing that's going on, moving troops away from frontiers, especially if they go for a long time, does disrupt the trading pattern that's going on. Those garrisons are people that want food, they want hides, they want quite a lot of products that can be profitable for the peoples outside the empire. You take them out of the equation, that can disrupt that system and makes you think, well, what am I going to do now? That's obviously more serious if there's a longer term departure, if they go away and stay away. But also, so at the same time as looking weak, you might also be leaving a lot of people high and dry because the business they've operated for a long time is no longer viable. On the other hand, when you have civil wars, there is also a vastly increased demand for manpower, for soldiers to fight them, and mercenaries, or allies, call them what you will. when one Roman army fights another Roman army, it doesn't have any inbuilt advantage in terms of tactics, equipment, command and control, doctrine, all these sorts of things. You're fighting against yourselves. So basically, you might be able to do these things better than the other side, but they're not fundamentally different. So if you're going to be confident of winning these campaigns, then you really want to get more troops, have a bigger army. Hit them with a bigger hammer, effectively. One of the ways to do that quickly, because you can't raise good regular troops very fast, it takes a while to equip them, to train them in particular, turn them into good soldiers, then if you go to warlike tribes beyond the frontiers and offer a chieftain a lot of money, a lot of gold, a lot of gifts, to give me 500 men, 1,000 men, 5,000 men, to come with me and fight in a civil war, then that's good for them. So a lot of people are being sucked into the Roman civil wars. There is then a danger, because if at least half of these Roman armies are going to lose, each of these wars is going to reach a result, there will be losers. Does the winner, he will want to take over as many Roman troops as he can, regulars, because they're useful, they're probably more reliable, but does he necessarily want to pay a lot of Germanic mercenaries under some chieftain he's never heard of? Are they necessarily going to accept a new leader? They've done a deal with someone, but that person's now gone, they're dead, they're defeated, so what do you do? There is a fair chance that some of the raiding bands of Germans that appear in the 3rd century sources have actually been invited into the Roman Empire in the first place and have ended up on the losing side in a civil war, or perhaps have been on the winning side but have got bored and don't feel they've been sufficiently rewarded. So that some of these groups are coming in. So it's part of this wider dislocation of everything that is making raiding from outside seem more formidable. So that's the situation on the European frontiers, and to some extent in parts of North Africa and elsewhere. It's slightly different with the Sassanians. Right, as a further blow to the continuity of this video, during the last pause I've switched back to the glasses I had on originally, because that makes it easier to read the quotes when they come out, when they become relevant. So anyway, we're talking now about the Persians. Ardashir I establishes the new dynasty in 224 by supplanting the Parthians. Basically, they rebel. They are regional leaders within the Parthian Empire. Remember, the Parthian king, as the Sassanian king will be, is king of kings. There are lots of sub-kings at various levels and other local leaders who are powerful. It's not quite feudal. That brings on some associations that don't quite work, but it's that sort of patchwork. It isn't a coherent, homogeneous kingdom. It's lots of groups that have come together under the central authority of a king of kings. Ardashir I, followed by Shapur I, his son, who will succeed him, or one of his sons, launch a series of attacks on the Roman provinces. Particularly Shapur I is very, very spectacularly successful. Antioch falls, 252, maybe again 260. Majority of the campaigns are in Mesopotamia and the border areas, so a lot of them don't go anywhere near as far as that. But you do get these few deep invasions, raids into Syria and even further. The Emperor Gordian's defeated and dies. The Persians rather claim that they did it, but probably not. So let's actually look at a couple of quotes before we go on into the detail. So Artaxerxes, as Dio calls him, Ardashir I. Again, it's this going back to the old Achaemenid names. Persians accordingly became a source of fear to us. For he, Ardashir, was encamped with a large army so as to threaten not only Mesopotamia but also Syria, and he boasted that he would win back everything that the ancient Persians had once held, as far as the Grecian Sea, claiming that all this was his rightful inheritance from his forefathers. The danger lies not in the fact that he seems to be of any particular consequence himself, but rather in the fact that our armies are in such a state that some of the troops are actually joining him and others are refusing to defend themselves. They indulge in such wantonness, license, and lack of discipline that those in Mesopotamia even dared to kill their commander, Flavius Heraclio. So that's interesting, and obviously Dio's a senator in Rome, so he's inclined to see things this way, but he's arguing it's not so much the Persians are strong, it's just that we are weak, and that the army is in a terrible state in this area. But again, think of the disruption. the murder of Caracalla, the civil war between Macrinus and Elagabalus has all happened in this area in the years, only a few years before Ardashir appears. There are then further disruptions, further civil wars, and more will accompany defeats at the hands of the Persians. You've got the business of, well, I'm hoping we'll get Harry Sidebottom on for an interview at some point in the Conversations thing, his novels about ballista and all this thing in that area. Things are greatly disrupted. You'll have the emergence of Palmyra and Athos, all this sort of thing, as we'll touch on in a minute. Let's just see a little bit from the Persian point of view, from the res gestae of the divine Shapur. And the Caesar, probably Philip the Arab, lied again and did injustice to Armenia. We marched against the Roman Empire and annihilated a Roman army of 60,000 men at Barbarissos. A battle that's not specifically mentioned in any Roman source, but again, the Roman sources are poor. A later section claims to have defeated 70,000 in 260 when the Emperor Valerian was captured. Well, some of the Roman sources are implying Valerian is captured while negotiating by the treacherous Persians. Maybe there's a battle, maybe there's skirmishes, some campaign with activity that leads to an overall, clearly it's an overall strategic defeat for the Romans, but quite how it happens. We get those glimpses from another point of view, from the Persians, saying what they're thinking of the Romans or what the great king of kings, wants you to believe about what's happened. But it's interesting that with Gordian, the Roman tradition is that he dies after a victorious campaign against the Persians. Shapur claims that, well, I beat him, he's dead, I beat him and killed him, he's dead. And he clearly was dead at the end of this campaign, but whether that was from disease, whether that was from treachery within his own ranks, a plot against him, or whether it actually was that he fell in battle against the Persians. To be honest, the odds are Shapur is probably putting a good gloss on something that, again, strategically he won the campaign because the Romans have come and attacked him. They've made headway, but in the end their emperor is dead and they retreat, even if they've chosen to retreat at first and the emperor dies subsequently. You get negotiations with Philip, you get the capture of Valerian, again, circumstances not entirely clear. The famous several different versions of this image of Shapur I with these groveling Roman emperors in front of him, either two or sometimes three. There can be Philip the Arab, Valerian probably, and Gordian. Gordian might be the corpse being trampled beneath his horse's feet a few occasions. Now, obviously, I've written on this. There's the Eagle and the Lion, Roman Persia, as it's called in the States. There are a few videos on this already. I can come back to this at another time. It's a lot more complicated than the simple view that the Persians turn up and they are far more formidable. However, we've got to point out that there are some things where clearly this seems to be more successful campaigns, more aggressive campaigns than any Parthian has done for a very long time, until you go back to the 1st century BC. So, what's different about them? Well, maybe there's more of a sense of organisation about their armies, and organisation in supply, that critical, very unglamorous but vital thing. You have from Dura Europus the evidence for siegecraft, the mines tunnelling in to undermine the Roman defensives, and of course the Roman countermines. The large camps that are being built there and a few other places that seem to be Sassanian camps. So that sense of a more organised army. Again, Dura Europus, we would not know about that siege were it not for the archaeology. It's listed as a place that Shapur takes, but that's it. And it's only... Right, I had to answer the phone there, so another one of these interruptions. It's going to be quite a disjointed talk, I fear, but hopefully the basic points will come through. Again, as I say, Dura Europus is something we wouldn't know about, and we wouldn't have that glimpse into Persian siege techniques, which shows how sophisticated an army they are by this point. That they're doing the sort of things we associate with the Romans in earlier periods, but that we haven't associated, that we generally felt the Parthians couldn't take cities very effectively, though that's a bit too simplistic because sometimes they have, we just don't know how. So there's siegecraft. In time, they'll start using war elephants. We don't quite know when those appear. They have a much greater emphasis on Clibanarii, the heavily armoured cavalryman, horse and man, both armoured, than the Parthians, where the horse archer is the prominent, sort of quintessential Parthian warrior. The heavily armoured cataphract is, as far as the Romans are concerned, the classic Persian. It's a more aggressive form of warfare, meeting the Romans. A willingness to meet the Romans in open battle is much greater under the Persians than it had been with the Parthians. Also, people are fond of talking of the Zoroastrian element to it, the revival of a version of perceived traditional Zoroastrianism, which has been a little bit different under the Parthians, where you get, obviously, you have these Sassanian monuments that show Ahura Mazda, the sort of head of the pantheon, as the heavenly counterpart to the great king, the King of Kings on earth, and granting power to Ardashir, granting power to Shapur, legitimizing them. And you get, there is a parallel to the achievements of the divine Shapur. There's an inscription of a Zoroastrian priest who talks about accompanying the king on his campaign, igniting fire temples, spreading the religion, as it were, within the Roman Empire. That sense that this is almost sort of crusading spirit within this. So that sometimes people see that they're more organized, their state becomes more organized, their army becomes more efficient, more technically proficient, and they are more strongly motivated by a religious belief that they are doing the right thing, fighting against these barbaric Roman enemies. The conclusion from all of this is that therefore they're much more dangerous, that somehow this switch from one dynasty to another transforms the stagnant Parthian Empire into the far more vibrant, far more dangerous Sassanian Persian Empire. We've got to be careful with this, because we really don't know much about what the Parthians are doing in the 2nd century AD. And we don't have a detailed account of the Parthians in battle against the Romans after Carrhae. We get the campaign under Nero, but that doesn't really involve pitched battles, as Tacitus describes it. We don't know what's going on in Trajan's campaigns. We don't know what's going on in Lucius Verus' campaigns, Septimius Severus's campaigns. There are battles won and lost, though predominantly the Romans win in those campaigns, but we don't know what's going on. We don't know if this engineering technology that allows the Sassanians to be more formidable at sieges has sprung up out of the ground, or whether it's evolved more gradually, developed more gradually, and the Parthians are picking things up. Hard to say, just because we don't know. What's more significant is that the Persian Empire is the old Parthian Empire with a new dynasty on top. And yes, they have some linguistic differences, some religious differences, but actually the continuity is far more significant. Ardashir and Shapur have won the civil war against the last Parthian King of Kings because they've persuaded enough of the nobility to back them. And that includes a lot of Parthian families. And some of those great noble families, those clans that go right the way through under the Parthians, under the Sassanians, and some of them last under the Arab kingdoms afterwards for some time. Regional powers that seem to be very, very strong, deeply entrenched. So what you've got are victors in a civil war. Victors in a civil war who have to prove that they deserve to win. Now, what better to do when you've just got to power through fighting your neighbours, basically, through your own people, through a king of kings to whom you've sworn oaths of loyalty, or the equivalent of, in the past, and you have served. You have rebelled, you've overthrown them, the new dynasty is in charge. You want to be seen as legitimate. Now, one of the best ways to unite people is to find a foreign enemy and go and do unpleasant things to them. Someone to bring everybody together. And the Romans are, of course, a perfect candidate because they're big, rather alien foreigners. They're big, they're powerful. They're also, conveniently enough, internally divided at this point because they're going through 3rd century crisis, call it what you will. There's been this breakdown in political stability, so the Romans are less able to face you just at a time when you need an enemy and you need good, clean glory of fighting foreigners. So there is a tendency to assume that the Sassanians are always as aggressive as they are under Ardashir, and particularly under Shapur. And even the last years of Shapur's reign, in part because of his age, he doesn't do so much against the Romans from about 260-ish, early 260s onwards. He tends to be more content to be peaceful. He might be doing stuff in the east as well. We never quite know. We hear about them much more when the Persians or Parthians look to the west than we do to the east. But they need to validate themselves by winning victories against the Romans, by putting on a good face, getting some glory, which Shapur does. He celebrates in a grand way. It's the Romans that are a most important feature in his res gestae, in this long inscription of his achievements. He mentions things elsewhere, but he really focuses on the Romans, and he's big on numbers. We had 60,000 at Barbalissos, 70,000 later on. There's long lists of all the different foreign barbarian groups that came with the Roman armies to face him. He's doing very much the sort of thing Roman emperors do when they celebrate how great they are. And as with them, you have to be a little bit careful about believing the veracity of everything he says, because it's in his interest to exaggerate. So for a while, you have the combination of leaders who need to prove themselves and unite the empire they've just seized, and a Roman Empire that is vulnerable. It's perhaps not surprising that there's an intensive period of conflict then, but it's much less so later. The Persians are nowhere near as aggressive as this all the time. They sometimes are, but it's not rare. The idea that there is this permanent major threat of another great empire on your eastern border simply does not ring true. And also, at other times, the Sassanians can seem very weak and vulnerable because of their own internal problems. When the Romans are strong, if they're weak, it's good for the Romans. Neither side really makes much headway in terms of long-term occupation and conquest of territory from the other. But when it does happen, it's much more often by the Romans, throughout the 3rd and even into the 4th century. Shapur leads these big expeditions deep into Roman territory, but he doesn't stay there. He sacks cities, but he doesn't occupy them permanently. And in many cases, as later on, he's probably extorting money from them by basically saying, pay me silver and gold to go away, otherwise I'll attack you. Nor is the religious aspect so simple as this old view makes out. The prophet Mani accompanies Shapur on some of his campaigns that will produce the Manichaeism, this religion that is subsequently suppressed. So there is the Zoroastrian strain, but that isn't the only thing that's going on. And that a priest of that particular cult happens to emphasize his role and the role of his faith as the most important thing. Well, that's what he would do, wouldn't he? So you have to be a little bit careful. You have campaigns that are really more about plunder, glory, and captives. There is this bringing the population to you to settle in communities that are royally controlled by the King of Kings, allow him to develop irrigation systems, maintain them, this sort of thing, which increases productivity, increases the food available, increases his power, his wealth. They are under his control, not anybody else's. And you've got the prestige, you've got the glory. So it's not as simple. In the last 10 years of his life, Shapur is not that aggressive. You have Odenathus of Palmyra raids Ctesiphon, which remains one of the main cities of the Persian Empire, as it has been of the Parthian Empire. It's where the King of Kings tends to be crowned, even centuries later. It's still the tradition there, as it had been under the Parthians. He raids it twice. He might not take the city, but he gets close. That's pretty embarrassing. That doesn't suggest overwhelming strength. Other Roman armies get there as well, and his successors tend to be quite weak because they're not the strong man who fought their way to power through civil war. Shapur is really good at fighting. If he wasn't, he and his father would have died when they rebelled against the Ardashir. They wouldn't have got where they were. And they lead an army, the core of which is really good at fighting and gets used to winning. But you can't maintain that permanently, whoever you are. It's the difference between facing up to Caesar's veterans when they've been campaigning for a decade or more in battle, compared to legions with the same numbers that are in ordinary peacetime have done relatively little. They might be well trained, but they don't yet have that confidence. Same with Alexander's veterans. You can give people a pike, a sarissa, and all the equipment, but it doesn't turn them into those same hard as nails soldiers who've marched to India and back and keep on fighting under the successors. So Persia's really strong. It is a power. it's not a superpower. It isn't Rome's equal. And that's the theme of, obviously, The Eagle and the Lion, Rome and Persia, gone into in more detail. It isn't necessarily such a profound change as people tend to make out. And a lot of it has to do with the circumstance of the 3rd century that then no longer apply later on. So let's think about the Roman emperor's job. People tend to assume, or scholars tend to assume, that from Marcus Aurelius onwards, an emperor needs to go on campaign, at least fairly often, at least to the big wars. Yet you could argue that it's not quite as simple. Lucius Verus goes out to supervise the Parthian War. When Marcus Aurelius goes to the Danube, Verus stays at Rome. Before that, Marcus Aurelius had stayed in Italy, stayed at home. Even Marcus Aurelius waited several years before going to the Danube. The Meditations show that he takes his job very, very seriously. And you get almost criticism in some of the sources, the idea that he was so earnest when he was dealing with any petition or problem that he would spend hours and hours on it and not get through a lot of business in the day because he was trying to get to the right result, which is great, but there's an awful lot for the emperor to do. Commodus isn't interested, so soon after he succeeds, he clears off back to Italy and doesn't really go on campaign again. He has been there a bit with his father, rather more than in the movie versions. Severus does go on campaign, but his situation is rather like we've been talking about with Ardashir and Shapur. He fights his way to supreme power, and his big victories of his early career are against other Romans. So probably not surprising that he goes and fights a war against the Parthians, twice, in fact, with one of the armies that's fought against him before in the Civil War, and then goes to Britain later in his life and will die here, campaigning north of Hadrian's Wall, campaigning against the Caledonians, but also leading the other army, the other provincial army that's been the heart of his opponent's support. So he's also proving I'm a good emperor, I can do great things for Rome, I don't just kill other Romans, I kill lots of foreigners as well. It's also making clear that to the armies that have sided against me, well, I can come along, I can start promoting anybody that I like, I can start winning you over. It's now your career depends on me, so, it's just make sure everybody knows who they are. You can also transfer in your own people, you can mix them together, trying to bond with them, trying to make sure they're under control. He needs that glory legitimacy. It's you could say the same about Augustus. He spends most of his reign, whether in person early on, but after about 19 more often from a distance, campaigning. There is lots of aggressive warfare in Augustus, the man who builds the altar of Augustan peace, who celebrates restoration of peace from civil war. But it's now getting glory against lots of nasty foreigners that's good, clean glory instead of fighting Mark Antony and people like that. Let's think a little bit about the army leaders and this transition from senators as the main source, the bulk of your army commanders, into officers who are generally from the equestrian order and don't have that mixed political and military career, civil and military, I should say, that's been traditional in the Roman system since the early days of the Republic. Senators are phased out. Now you have supposedly Gallienus' decree, and I know there's a question about this. This will be a short answer. We might do a long one another time. Really only attested in Aurelius Victor, De Caesaribus, on the Caesars, 33-37. So there's not a lot of evidence for it, but that's a problem. We have so little evidence for a lot that's going on in the 3rd century. And the pattern from surviving career inscriptions seems to be, rather than a simple, right, we're not going to have any more senators in charge of armies, I'm just going to trust equestrians, senators can stick with civil life and judicial stuff and all that sort of thing, but I'm not going to use them to command my armies. What you get is, first there seem to be hardly any tribunes. So the first stage of a senatorial career, first military stage being senior tribune in a legion, that seems to stop. Then they seem to stop being a legate of a legion, the commander of a legion, something you'd normally do around about the age of 30. And then eventually after that, they stop being provincial legates as well. Now, it might be a pattern that obviously you've got people going through the system that are still doing this, but nobody's following them on. Whether this is such a deliberate thing, somebody like Gallienus saying, right, I don't trust you anymore, we're not going to do this, or whether it just seems to be happening at that time and people, at least some attribute it to him later on, harder to say. There are still senators who become governors, but they're very rarely of military provinces with any significant garrison from then on. At the same time, you've got a reduction in the size of your typical province. So under the Severans, you get a reduction of no province will contain more than 2 legions. So Britain, which has been a 3 and occasionally 4 legion province up to now, becomes split into Upper and Lower Britain. Syria gets split up into several provinces. Syria, you've already had Syria, Palestina, and this sort of thing. That tendency will continue until you get to the stage of the Notitia Dignitatum, late 4th, early 5th century, where Britain is 4 or 5 provinces, and most of the others have broken up into that sort of number. So what was 1 province under Augustus or Hadrian is now about 4 or 5. Within each of those provinces, instead of having one man as governor who combines supreme judicial, military, and civil authority in his person, now you have a separate civilian hierarchy and military hierarchy. And then eventually you will also divide the military into the limitani, the more permanently stationed troops, the, say frontier troops to some extent, but we will talk in the future about the limitani, comitatenses, and what all this means in a bit more detail when we get on to our late Roman army theme next year sometime. And then the comitatenses, the field forces, are under a different command structure, different hierarchy, different people involved. There's no sign that any of this was done because it was felt to be more efficient militarily, a more effective way of doing things. Instead, it seems to be a matter of trust. And you can see aspects of this. There are hints of this early on. Bear in mind, when Augustus turns Egypt into a province, it's the only major province with legions in it that he gives to an equestrian governor. And that becomes normal and continues right the way through. And it seems to be its sensitive nature. Partly it's seen as almost private property of the emperor, and the emperor does have a lot of estates there that he directly owns. But it's also this thought, well, I'd had trouble with Antony here, but also Egypt is so potentially wealthy, supplies so much grain, and it's quite difficult to access from the west or from the east. The approaches are narrow, restricted by the terrain. Therefore, I don't want anybody to be getting any ideas. Senators were banned from even visiting Egypt as a tourist. You can't go there without its specific imperial permission. And there is a question mark when Germanicus, even though he's the adopted son of Tiberius, when he visits Egypt, whether he should have done or not. You get the same level of, the same way of thinking with Septimius Severus. He annexes Mesopotamia. The governor is an equestrian. He raises 3 new legions, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Parthica. Each are commanded by an equestrian prefect rather than a senatorial legatus. Now, the only legions like that before were the ones in Egypt, because you couldn't have senators serving under an equestrian governor. It would rather wreck the whole point of the thing if you allow senators to go there anyway. So it really is a question of trust. It's hard to say that these are professionals, that these are specialist soldiers in any way. Bear in mind, for all the classic one, there's no staff college at Rome, senators don't receive any military training. Well, nor do equestrians. They are appointed in the same way by the emperor. He chooses to give them military appointments, and then they pick up experience as they go along. But the classic one has always been that you get given the command of a cohort of infantry, a smallish battalion by modern standards, with no prior military experience whatsoever. You're just told, yeah, fair enough, you can do this. And you're supposed to pick it up. You don't get trusted with cavalry until a bit later, because you can really mess up horse care, and that's expensive. But nevertheless, it's there isn't any selection or training. There doesn't seem to be any obvious difference in competence. Unless you come back with this set idea that, well, things are much more dangerous later on. So the fact that the Roman army wins at all means that its commanders are better than they were in the past. because the senators would have just lost all the time. The amateurs from before, so they must be better. And also, if they're specializing in having a military career, then they're automatically better. Well, they should at least be more experienced, and that might well translate into greater efficiency, at least in some cases. But if you look at the British Army post-Cardwell, the abolition of purchasing of commissions in latter part of Victoria's reign, it isn't obvious that that made everybody better. And if you look at some British operations in the later Victorian era, let alone the First and the Second Anglo-Boer Wars, particularly the early stages of the Second, by which time there really would be nobody who'd come in through purchase left, even at brigade level and higher divisional level. They're not always that great. Now, that might be problems of the nature of the imperial police force that it's effectively having to do most of the time, the nature of training. You have got staff college, you have got Sandhurst more formally organised than it had been in the past, you have got the training within units, you've got inspections, all of these sorts of things. But it isn't quite so simple. Whilst we can see that a system like purchasing commissions is likely to be bad, it still produces the Duke of Wellington, it produces Sir John Moore, people like that, who do very well. It produces Sir William Erskine, the madman, and others who clearly do not know what they are doing. But nevertheless, it's not a great system, but it can sometimes beat the odds and you get good people through. There isn't much sign for a formal selection on the basis of competence rather than loyalty later on, other than the point that, well, if you're an emperor, you really don't want to appoint too many buffoons to senior posts because their defeats will reflect on you. But remember, come back to this point that you're far more likely as emperor to die at the hands of other Romans than you are of foreign enemies. So loyalty is a major, major concern because civil war threats against you are so very common. These are real possibilities. It isn't just a theoretical thing. This might well happen because it has happened very recently and everybody knows that. So you do have to be rather more careful. It's easy to think in a sort of modern terms where you're not going to get somebody in the British Army or the US Army or Australian Army or whatever suddenly declaring themselves, right, well, I think I'd make a better prime minister than the current one, so let's go to seat of government and shoot him and take over and just proclaim myself. These sorts of ideas, the British system, which is reflected in the American one, reflected in a lot of Commonwealth former imperial ones, since the 17th century, is the whole idea is that the army shouldn't get involved in politics, not directly, since the Civil War. Civilian politicians are in charge, ultimately. But that's just not there for the Romans. And in fact, you're dealing with a world where you've got the classic quotes of Augustus when Tiberius is complaining of people who've been writing things, criticizing them, and Augustus said, well, don't worry about what they write, worry about what they do. Tiberius describing governing the empire, being the emperor, as holding a wolf by the ears. It's been dangerous, it's been risky. There's always been the perception, the fear of conspiracy, of threats, of rebellion. But it's uncommon early on. From the 3rd century onwards, and it never really stops, it is normal, it's usual. This happens very often. And you do not get many years, as I say, 2 decades without a civil war at all. That's it in 2.5 centuries. It's not, this is not great. So it tends to be about trust, and the fact that you have Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who overthrows Caracalla and arranges for his murder, makes himself emperor, and is accepted by the Senate, even though he's an equestrian. Later on, you've got Maximinus Thrax, again, another equestrian. Clearly, you can't trust every equestrian. They are not always loyal in the way that senators were not. It doesn't make civil war less common. If anything, it makes it more frequent. You could argue that at least in the old days, this sense of men who were suited to be emperor is something that Tacitus discusses when he's talking about the debate after the death of Augustus. You had to be a senator of a certain status to consider an attempt at the purple. With the pattern whereby emperors are no longer particularly well connected before they get to emperor. They are just army officers. There's a lot more army officers out there with ambition and potential emperors. They tend to choose men they know, so when, as their senior subordinates, so when the emperor is an equestrian, the more great likelihood is he will choose other fellow equestrians for senior posts. The consequence, perversely, is actually it's harder to control than it had been in the past, because in the early days, with the Senate, when there were 600 at the most senators, the emperor could know them all as individuals. You can't do that with the tens of thousands of equestrians dotted around the empire, even with the ranks of the senior officers, because a lot of them aren't close to you all the time. They're out doing their job. It's much harder. You don't need that sort of political work. All you need to do is be able to rally enough Roman troops to back your claim, and you have a chance of becoming emperor. And one of the other problems is that, apart from controlling the equestrians doesn't prove very easy, as you begin to divide provinces up, it's harder for provincial governors to deal with any major problem. You know, in the old days, the governor in Britain had a very large army at his disposal. So did the Syrian governor. They could deal with quite major conflicts on their own. And it was only if it went wrong that you had to bring troops from elsewhere, and maybe the emperor had to think about going himself. Problem is now that you've taken that level of your hierarchy out. There are no longer people with that much authority. And as it gets more pronounced, as you divide off civilian and military authority, then you divide the limitani from the comitatenses and this sort of thing, you end up with nobody on the spot who can actually command enough troops and has the authority to command people to give them supplies, pay, all the things they need to wage war. The old provincial governor could order that to happen, and it would happen. Nobody in the system can do that later on unless the emperor appoints somebody with an extraordinary command, like Odenathus of Palmyra, Priscus, the brother of Philip the Arab in the east. You get these people given larger commands. Now, it's happened before. Corbulo and others have done this in the past, but it becomes routine at this point, or the extension from that is that you need more emperors to do this because they're the only one who can go to the spot and order everybody around and make sure that all the resources that the empire still possesses are actually marshalled to be used in this military enterprise. But of course, giving people these extraordinary commands is an even greater risk, and doesn't turn out too well in several cases in the 3rd century. Local successes encourages a bid for the throne, and of course, in this nervous climate, if you're very successful, you're going to realize that, well, that's great, I've done wonderful things, but you're also going to think, well, the emperor's probably going to be suspicious of me. And people will be whispering in his ear that I'm a threat, that I'm plotting. So maybe I just preempt and I do it, because it comes back to the Silvanus situation in Gaul. I rebel because I've been condemned anyway, even though I'm innocent. So what have I got to lose? I'm dead anyway. I might as well. My only chance of life is actually overthrowing the emperor, which is not a good long-term thing. So we come back to this. Who is the enemy? From the Roman point of view, and it's very clear in all the sources throughout 3rd century, 4th century and beyond, another Roman who appears and claims to be emperor is always perceived as a far greater, more serious threat than foreigners, the barbarians, even including the Sassanian Persians. The Sassanians are never going to get to Italy. They're not going to water their horses in the Tiber. It's simply not possible. And they even, they do get to Antioch a couple of times, but not often, and they can't stay there. They simply don't have that might. The Romans far more often will march down the Tigris and Euphrates to the heartland of Ctesiphon, Seleucia, those cities there. Again, they can't stay in the long term, but nevertheless, they are just as threatening. And curiously enough, emperors are often willing to settle with foreign leaders so that they are free to go and deal with a Roman threat. So you get this in the pattern of treaties with the Sassanian kings of kings. You get it even with Germanic leaders and other tribal leaders elsewhere. Just calm things down here. Okay, we'll make some concessions to you because I've got more important things to do elsewhere. Even Marcus Aurelius and Avidius Cassius, he stops his campaigning in the Danube and goes east because this man has challenged him. As I say, the whole thing has happened by accident because a false story of Marcus Aurelius' death has circulated. And given all the plague and everything that's been going on, the fact that Marcus Aurelius wasn't a robust man at any stage, easy to believe. And once you've made that decision and thought, well, again, it's the difficult thing even at that stage. I'm big, I'm famous, I'm a successful general. I could be emperor, but other people are going to think that. So if I don't make a claim myself, somebody else might, and they're probably not going to trust me. That all gets far worse, much, much worse later on. So, but what happens is that repeatedly emperors will strip the frontier provinces of troops to go off and wage civil war against other Romans. It comes back to all that we were talking about earlier. The frontiers become weak because there is nobody there. And you're needed elsewhere. Again, to win these civil war battles, you want a bigger army than the enemy because you don't have other advantages. So you get units broken up. So for instance, Gallienus, whose frontier effectively has come to be in northern Italy because you've got the breakaway Gallic Empire under a succession of emperors there. You're losing control in the east. It's again these periods where there are several challengers, usurpers, emperors simultaneously. There are records of at least 13 legions within his field force. He seems to concentrate there, but clearly not. This is still the stage when there are only about 33 legions altogether. That's clearly not all 13 of them are actually there. Bits of them are still in other provinces, but you've taken vexellations away. Now, there's a lot of stuff about his mobile field army, this idea it's a sort of precursor to what comes later, and that he has this cavalry army that's this great, very fast-moving reserve. Now, I'm hoping to get, when I can arrange it, Duncan Campbell has written a terrific book on this, basically debunking the whole thing and saying, well, this is what the evidence really says, and these theories have somehow built on top of each other so that scholars repeat this stuff. What he seems to have are lots of detachments from here, there, and everywhere, significant cavalry forces, that's what I'm saying, but it's not a reserve, partly because it's pretty much stationed on the frontier of what he controls because of these breakaway sections. So what you have is an army that's scattering into detachments. You get fighting between people within the same units. You get evidence for some destruction within camps, things being torn down, standards in Upper Germany and Rhaetia. Comes back to all this thing. How does the army function when this is going on? So for instance, you've got 10th Fretensis as a legion, and maybe a vexillation ends up under the command of one of the rival emperors while some of it stays with the one who's controlling the region where the main base is. How do you work promotion for that unit? You'll want somebody to be primus pilus, you'll want the tribunes, you'll want the other grades of centurion, let alone all the other ranks. Do you fill that post as if you are the only legitimate part of that unit, or do you bear in mind that there might be another primus pilus off with the other lot and people filling other ranks? How does that work? There's no evidence one way or the other for how it works, but it's a clear problem. It's going to dislocate your training. Hadrian, back at Lambysis, when he's giving these speeches, this sort of pep talk at the end of exercise to the units of the Provincial army, and talks about the 3rd Legion having performed well in spite of the fact that it sent a vexillation off to another 3rd Legion, and there's also got a cohort off in the province of Africa serving the governor, so that you're under strength, you're undermanned, some of the pick of your men have gone away, but you still did really, really well. This is dislocation on a far greater scale than that, and yet that was perceived as something that could weaken your combat readiness, effectiveness, standards of training. Discipline, even more so. We've talked about this already. So it's going to be hard to maintain discipline when soldiers can do well and can get promotion by killing their superiors, where people are out there offering you bribes and money to defect and join another emperor. This is not great. These are serious challenges of a sort that so often as scholars we're looking at modern Western armies has not been an issue, is not something we associate with how militaries work. So this aspect of the Roman system at this time is very, very different. It's really not surprising. There's so many defeats and the frontiers are weak, they're undermanned, and of course that encourages more attacks, leads to more defeats. you're even weaker, you're even worse, you become dispirited. That morale, that's, there's always that fragile thing that it builds on success. You get more confident and you have it, you also tend to feel more down the more defeats you suffer, and it becomes harder to win. But there's no enemy that poses a remotely serious threat to the existence of the empire. And perhaps you could argue there's a chance of fragmentation in the 3rd century into a couple of Roman empires, maybe 2 or 3. But even the Persians, they are not annexing significant parts of Roman territory. Not on a permanent basis, not even in the border areas. It is all very, very limited. Basically, all the big wars you fight are large-scale raids. They are expeditions for plunder, to take captives, to win glory. Show how great you are by sticking it to the Romans. But it isn't any coherent attempt at destroying, taking over, seizing Roman territory in a permanent way, let alone destroying the Roman Empire. So let's move on and think about the field armies and mobile reserves and this sort of idea. This thought earlier on that, well, the empire earlier on, everything's round, everything's in the shop window, he who defends everything defends nothing, all this sort of stuff, and you've got no reserves, so if a big threat comes through, how do you deal with it? Most of this concept of developing towards mobile reserves and field armies doesn't really work in the way that it's claimed. As I say, we'll talk more about Gallienus's army when we get Duncan Campbell on. It's Milan, but that's not a reserve because that's basically near the frontier of what he's controlling. And again, this idea that it's predominantly cavalry doesn't work. Apart from that, from a strategic point of view, in the short term, cavalry can move a long way fast, but if you want them to do much and keep the horses in decent nick, that's not going to happen. The best in every period is a well-balanced all-arms force that combines and operates well together. It's unlikely to be this huge force that scholars have imagined. It's probably quite small. You get Constantine and the Comitatenses, so let's go to another quote, this time from Zosimus. So, by the foresight of Diocletian, the frontiers of the Roman Empire were everywhere studded with cities and forts and towers, in the way I have already described, and the whole army was stationed along them, so that it was impossible for the barbarians to break through, as the attackers were everywhere withstood by an opposing force. But Constantine ruined this system by withdrawing the majority of the troops from the frontiers and stationing them in the cities, which did not require protection. That's Zosimus, the pagan, praises Diocletian, doesn't like the Christian Constantine, but then authors tend to have, Roman authors, very strong opinions about emperors and feel no reluctance in expressing them. It's a great exaggeration. There are still plenty of buildings and forts on the frontiers. They tend to be smaller. The number of troops stationed in areas tends to reduce. Even on Hadrian's Wall, where forts like Vindolanda, Housteds, Bert Oswald, these remain in occupation. The garrison size does seem to be significantly reduced from the second half of the 3rd century, so that you have a unit, the cohort of so-and-so, who are still there, but they're not as big, even on paper, as they used to be. However, and also there's another difference, particularly in the eastern provinces, troops have been stationed in cities from quite early on. There were always troops near Alexandria, Antioch, this sort of thing. But there is an element of truth within this. We don't know much about how things work. When you look at the army, units just tend to be smaller. But there aren't good figures, and when you estimate the overall size of the army, those are almost certainly wildly exaggerated. This 600,000 plus seems extraordinarily unlikely, and the big thing that makes you wonder is that whenever you get a description of a campaign, the field armies don't seem very big. So where are all these people going? What are they doing? Where are they living? They can be living in cities, because the big bases have gone. You don't have the legionary fortresses anymore. As I've said elsewhere, when those fortresses go, what about the stable facilities? What about the training facilities? What about the administrative facilities? What about the infrastructure that allows your army to train, drill, be supplied, kept in good health, be ready for operations? Once you start to billet people in towns, you can do those things, but it's that much harder. and it's particularly harder to, say, care for a large number of horses. Where's the training time? How does the recruitment work and the training for new recruits? When all's said and done, once you actually get to a campaign starting, none of these armies are any more mobile or less mobile than the earlier ones. You're still going to be moving at the same pace based around the amount of food you can carry, the supply system. So it's going to be mule packed, it's going to be ox carts. Smaller armies for shorter periods can move faster and further, but that's within the limits. That's always been the case. Big armies will tend to be slower because they need more in the way of a baggage train, and that slows you down. But the armies later on are not doing anything drastically different from, say, Caesar's legions in Gaul in terms of their operating speed. And they're probably smaller on average in terms of the field forces. That's, again, another thing we'll talk about another day. And the idea that, well, you know, they can be split up into units and this sort of thing, well, that's always been the case, you know, apart from the fact that you've had the legions with their big 5,000 man building blocks and cohorts ally of 500. The legions can be broken up into 10 cohorts or other sized detachments. There is one big difference. There is nothing equivalent to the 5,000 man legion as the building block of a large army. So this is a system that does not lend itself as effectively to large field forces or concentration in one place. It would be harder to control. You've just got to tell more people what to do. There aren't permanent brigadings beyond the pairs of units where people are used to working together, know where they should be in formation, and can trust everybody to support them properly. If anything, the greater number of units is a sign of weakness. It's again, seems to come in this idea that what you're really worried about is the threat of other Romans, the threat of usurpers, because you don't want somebody to come along and be able to control several legions as the basis of an army. That quickly gives them a big field army. It's much harder to convince lots of leaders of separate, effectively cohort-sized units, and that's pretty much what they are. 500 to 1,000 or so seems to be the pattern. That's the usual estimate for most of the different types of units, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more. You know, Constantine seems to have one field army that follows him around in his campaigns, but partly an emperor's having to campaign more because he's less secure. It's not that the world is more dangerous because of what's happening outside. Then when you have more than one emperor, then they're all going to want their Palatine troops and others, their field force that will follow them around, will be at their ready disposal. They won't necessarily be following them all the time, but something they can use, and wherever they go, it will travel with them. That's obviously something new, but again, to argue that, well, this is just what's needed rather than this is what happened with lots of insecure emperors. And of course, the cumulative damage. Your frontiers are that much weaker because you can't dominate and impress people quite as much as you could in the past. When any of these things go wrong, that aura of invincibility cracks, and it's very hard to regain. So that in earlier periods when the army was stronger and generally speaking, there were troops occupying most of the frontier areas, warfare might be fairly uncommon because you do just give that impression that you're too strong. But once you're seen as weak, it's very hard to prove to everyone that you are strong and remain strong and deter them. It's when you think about cavalry and that sort of thing. I mean, again, you've got the famous quote from Vegetius, writing turn of the 4th into the 5th century, emphasizing cavalry. For despite progress in cavalry arms, thanks to the example of the Goths, the Alans, the Huns, the infantry, as is well known, go unprotected. From the founding of the city down to the time of the deified Gratian, the infantry was equipped with both body armour and helmets. But upon the intervention of neglect and idleness, field exercises ceased, the arms which the soldiers rarely donned began to be thought heavy. So they petitioned the emperor they should hand in first the body armour, then the helmets. Thus, with their chests and heads unprotected, our soldiers have often been destroyed in engagements against the Goths through their multitude of archers. Vegetius is there presenting a view that the infantry is no longer very good, and therefore I'll tell you about the old-fashioned legion so we can copy that and we can be good again. But it does come into this element where the infrastructure underlying the army that produces equipment, that trains people and drills people comes back to this repetition. You've got to do things a lot. Armour is heavy, it is bulky, it is cumbersome. If you wear it a lot, if you exercise in it a lot, you become more and more used to that, and the burden is significantly less. At any period, if you don't do that, then it's a dreadful shock. I mean, in a modern army, if you haven't worn a helmet for a long time, suddenly being given one, it feels heavier than if you get used to it. You could say that about a lot of equipment. Your webbing, its load up and all that sort of thing. You get, the more experience, but also wear it well, distribute it properly so the weight is properly spread, as comfortable as you can make it, but you simply get used to it. You train yourself to doing it. Vegetius is exaggerating, grossly oversimplifying, but there's something to be said for the idea that in those later generations, the army isn't always as good as it might be because the circumstances don't allow it to be. If you get good commanders, good officers, then they'll get people trained and you can build up the same sort of efficiency as you've had in the past. You know what you should do, at least the theory is there, but you don't always have the capacity to do it and the leisure to do it. And of course, you've got to be careful not to be seen to be too keen and therefore too ambitious. I think really we'll finish now because, as I say, there are lots of things we've just touched upon and they're far, far more complicated. There are lots of things about the structure, the unit types, the organisation of the later period army that we will look at in future. But for today, I just wanted to raise some of these possibilities and get us thinking in that way, so when we do come back to it, hopefully we can build on this. The big thing is always, and again, even people who will present a different view of later antiquity, the empire and the army at that period, the best ones do this, you've got to place everything in the context. The army is part of the state, it's paid for by the state. Its problems, therefore, tend to be linked to how well the state is working and the funding system of the state, how efficient that is. The basic purpose of government definitely does change. And the focus becomes far more on survival in the face of internal rivals. It's always been there from Augustus onwards, but it becomes far more pronounced. It becomes the basic priority, first and foremost. And after that, you do all the make the empire prosperous, make it glorious and all this sort of thing. Sort of stuff, Pliny flatters Trajan with in the 2nd century about how this will add to the fame of your reputation, the luster of your reign, all this sort of thing. Trying to do things for other people, trying to... it goes back to the Augustan ideal, even if it's only a half-truth, that you are the greatest magistrate, the greatest servant of the state. You are working on behalf of the Commonwealth, the res publica, for the good of all, for the good of the wider state, the community of your fellow citizens. That's become a much more distant thing. It's not gone altogether, but it is less significant. That desire, that to remain alive, remain in power, because they're the same thing from emperors, because you don't tend to survive a usurpation, that tends to dominate your thought at every stage, and it influences how the army works, how the state works, generally speaking, not in a good way. But the empire is still far, far bigger than any of its neighbours. It's far richer. Even the Sassanian Persian Empire is not equal to Rome. Perhaps when the Western Empire has fallen, you could look at it, and even then it's similar geographically, although I suspect the wealth probably still favours the Romans, maybe population as well. In 300, even in 400 AD, this is still true. The empire is bigger, the empire is wealthier, but it's less strong in 400 than it had been in 300. The army is still the best in the world and the biggest, but again, it's less able to live up to that potential as often. So it doesn't mean everything is gloomy, everything is grim. It's just the situation, the infrastructure, the state which produces this army has changed fundamentally, and clearly the trajectory is from greater stability, wealth, strength to less of those things, but you are still bigger than anyone else out there, and that makes a huge difference. But you can see in campaigns like the Gothic War and others that they can't marshal those resources quite as efficiently as they've generally been able to do in the past. So again, this is just an introduction. This is some thoughts about the broader context of the Roman army from the 3rd century through to 400 and a bit beyond. and how that reflects changes within the empire, trying to put the balance, trying to say, well, maybe it's not quite as simple as the generally rather rosy view. The late antiques specialists tend to present that, yes, there's a crisis in the 3rd century, but they get past that crisis, and if anything, they emerge leaner, meaner, more efficient, stronger, better than they had been before. I don't believe that. I still think that, yes, it's strong, it's efficient in some ways, but on the whole, I think the system functions less well, and I am less inclined to believe that the threats from outside begin by becoming stronger, and that causes change within the Roman Empire. I think there is a little bit of that with the rise of the ambitious Ardashir and Shapur and their needs to fulfill their glory and cement their position in charge. Actually, that's less of a change than we might think, and it's the changes within the empire that render it less able to deal with problems on the frontiers, whether with the Persians or elsewhere, that make it seem weaker, that tend to spiral and make it harder to deal with, so that it's Roman weakness that encourages the threats to become stronger. They then feed off that weakness, so they are genuinely stronger than before. That means you have to deal with them in different ways. So in some ways, I suppose I'm coming back to this idea that threats can become stronger, but I think it's because it's not just, oh, the Romans were unlucky, suddenly things turn more hostile in the 3rd century AD. I think there are basic political decisions and changes within politics and society that lead towards this. Make the Romans more vulnerable, therefore the threats grow. But anyway, that's it for today. As I say, next year we'll be coming back to the late Roman army, and we'll be looking at this, and we'll also hopefully have some more conversations with specialists in the period as well. So there's a lot more to come, though it might not be for a fair while yet. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.